Juarez, Mexico, is one of the most famous border cities in the world, and for 30 years, it's been home to a series of unsolved murders. Hundreds of young women have disappeared there without a trace.
Numbers started to rise, and then a lot of theories were floated up. The serial murder, the cartels, some sort of strange devil worship.
In Forgotten Women of Juarez, we follow a story that's left a trail of destruction in its wake, with FBI agents, forensic experts, reporters, and victims' families.
There could be an abduction in broad daylight. No one saw it. No one talked about it. These were like ghosts.
And we discover a web of corruption on both sides of the border.
It was scary. When you think about who may be involved, oh my God, it's like, oh my God.
It's a very, very, very dangerous place of the city. I wouldn't recommend you guys to go back.
Binge the first season now and find Forgotten Women of Juarez on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
On this episode of Newt's World.
In the first half of 1993, before I was mayor, there were 67 murders in East New York. This year, in the first half, there were 14 too many. Here in Harlem, in the first half of 1993, there were 27 murders. This year, there were only 5. And there has been a significant drop in crime, even more significant in the minority neighborhoods than in the rest of the city. That comes about because the police and communities most often work together.
Based on the suggestions of the caucus, based on the work of the task force, that we will be moving funding from the NYPD to youth initiatives and social services. I want people to understand that we are committed to shifting resources to ensure that the focus is on our young people. I think the systematic, overtly racist use of stop and frisk was an abject failure.
Hi, this is Newt. Due to the virus, I'm recording from home, so you may notice a difference in audio quality. On this episode of Newt's World, how do we clean up our cities from the crime and chaos that has taken over the streets? There are very few leaders who have really turned cities around and made them safer. While he was mayor, New York used a focused form of policing, including applying the broken windows strategy and launching a new crime tracking system called CompStat. The result was almost half of New York's crime dropped in the 1990s, and its continuing drop in crime rates throughout the 2000s has resulted from this innovative policing. Not until Mayor de Blasio began to go away from this did crime start back up. Now, New York City and other cities around the nation are seeing an uptick in crime and in violent shootings. How can we begin to bring law and order back to our cities? I'm pleased to welcome my guest and my good friend, Mayor Rudy Giuliani. He served as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York from 1983 to 1989, then was elected Mayor of New York City from 1994 to 2001. He's been called America's Mayor for his leadership through the September 11, 2001 attacks, and was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 2001. I've known Rudy Giuliani for a long time. He gained a national reputation for crime-fighting success as New York's mayor. And of course, for most of us, he became really a national figure because of his leadership after the 9/11 attacks in New York. During his mayoralty from 1994 to 2001, crime statistics declined significantly. And in fact, if you go back and look at pictures of Times Square just before Rudy gets elected, and then look at pictures of Times Square 8 years later, it's amazing how much the city had become safer, cleaner, more tourists, more people, all 24 hours a day. People felt more comfortable wandering around. And the program he instituted, and his book on leadership really explained this brilliantly, but his CompStat program gave the police department the ability to figure out where crime was occurring and to try to get ahead of it, not just to solve it, but to preempt it. So let me say, first of all, Mr. Mayor, I'm thrilled that you're here. And I'm curious, you must almost have a sense of deja vu watching the crime rates going back up, watching cities adopt the dumbest possible policies. It's as though the current situation, they're repudiating all of the sound principles you applied and recreating the disaster that was there before you became mayor. What's your reaction to what you're watching?
I guess I have to begin with the fact, being a New Yorker, all my life, I'm heartbroken because it's something that I lived through. I lived through the earlier one. It started under John Lindsay, believe it or not, in the 1960s or early 70s, and it lasted until 1994. So I have a feeling that if we don't get control of this, this becomes a long-lasting process. It just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. It's sort of the opposite of the broken windows theory, right? The broken windows theory works at the bottom, teaches people respect for law and order. You also arrest the dangerous criminals at the same time. And over a 2-year period, 3-year period, you can see crime come down. Now what they're doing is they're basically saying to everyone, break the law and nothing will happen to you. Do not respect the police. In some ways, it's worse than the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Even with those terrible riots we had back then, you wouldn't see somebody slapping a police officer or spitting at a police officer. The cops were still feared in the right way. And they could break up a riot eventually. Now, it's as if the police are you and me. I mean, they can just slap them around, push them around. How many times, Newt, did you see a store looted and police officers were watching? In New York, in Chicago, and St. Louis, and that gives license to every one of the other criminals that's thinking about looting, stealing, robbing, raping, shooting their other gang member. It basically gives them permission. Go ahead, do it. And that's what's happening. And it's happening faster than I ever thought it would. It really is. It's a tragedy. The other thing that it's hard to convey to people because, they know I'm a Republican and they think it's very partisan, but this really comes from my knowledge of criminal justice. This is purely because of Democratic policies. De Blasio is pro-criminal. He's done away with bail. He's let about 10,000 people out of prison. He tells the police not to enforce the law numerous times, particularly in riots. And he paints Black Lives Matter all over the place. And unless you're a fool, Black Lives Matter is an anti-police, anti-law enforcement, anti-white organization that wants to create violence.
When you took over in this kind of environment, I think everybody was surprised how fast you began to turn things around. What do you think was the key to that? And what were your insights that really made you far and away the most effective anti-crime mayor in modern American history?
We did two things, Newt. It really took about 2 years to really turn it around. But Bill Bratton and I decided we'd have to have a couple of victories first because the people of New York were weary and they were depressed. And they felt that nobody could reduce crime. People have been promising that for 30 years and failing. I was told by all my friends that I couldn't do it and that I was ruining an otherwise decent career by being mayor. But we picked out a few things where we could show people change. We went after what we'll call then the squeegee operators, the people who come up to your window, clean your window, started off really nice 20 years earlier. By the time we get to the 1990s, they're slashing your tires, they're stealing your purse, they're breaking your windows. So we went out and did a survey of them. We figured out how many there were. We used our fledgling ComStat system to put them on a computer and on a map. And we almost did like a military exercise. We went out one night with about 300 cops. We got rid of about 3/4 of them in one night. And then the next night, we got rid of a few more. And all of a sudden, people are driving into the city, and these people that have been bothering them for 20 years are now gone. We didn't even put out a press release. We let it get out. And then we said, oh, that's just a little bit of what we can do. We found the place in the city that had the most crime and that was exporting the most crime, Brooklyn North. And we put all our resources there, and we brought crime down. We started with the worst place rather than the easiest place. And that got under control very quickly. And from then on, everybody bought into it. And even the Times, the first year I was doing it, it was claiming I was bringing back stormtrooper tactics. And they sort of bought into it when they saw we weren't doing stormtrooper tactics, that this was almost a scientific approach to crime reduction by using ComStat, where crimes occur, put it in a computer, what time of day, where are the police, if auto theft is happening in the southern part of Brooklyn and drugs in the northern part, why do we have our auto theft people all over the city and not just concentrated in Brooklyn? Basically, by creating a lawful community where people don't do graffiti and vandalize and get away with it, people don't jump over turnstiles and get away with it, you're teaching the young people to respect the law. And that's maybe a 4 or 5 year process, but it's better than just arresting. Arresting is a short-term solution, and broken windows is a long-term solution. And then really good social programs, not the ridiculous, idiotic social programs that made me a Republican. I was the prosecutor when Lindsay was the mayor, and I investigated the social programs of the Great Society. And if they were spending 25% of the money on people, it was a lot. I really became a Republican because of the crookedness in the Democratic Party that I observed as a prosecutor.
When you started developing this, one of the things I was most fascinated by is, you had a unionized bureaucracy in the police force and a big police force, and you somehow managed to convince them that they were going to have to change. How did you do that?
Well, first of all, my police commissioner and I removed probably 3/4 of the senior leadership of the department. And not because they weren't good people, or some of them I had worked with as a prosecutor. They never would have listened to us. It would be like telling the Pentagon, you got to fight a war differently. You better get other generals that are going to listen to you, because they're going to tell you you're too stupid and we're not going to listen to you, or they'll yes you to death. But we knew bureaucracy well enough to know we had to clean them out. So on one day, Bratton got rid of 25 people at the highest levels. We brought in much younger people. Many of them have gone on to be police commissioners and had great success elsewhere. And they all bought into, because the major change we were making is the cops had to accept accountability. All of a sudden, there was going to be this system. The primary design of it was to help us figure out how to use our resources strategically, CompStat. But what it would do is focus on where cops are doing their job and where they're not. And we had people quit. We had people refuse to comply with it. You literally had a commanding officer. They would have to report once every 2 weeks to headquarters and go through a CompStat meeting. We had one guy that got so drunk, he was so nervous that he walked into the meeting drunk. It was really pathetic. It was a fascinating thing to watch accountability take over. And the other thing that was fascinating about it, because I'd love to see this in schools, all of a sudden the good people come to the fore. They say, I've been busting my you-know-what to do a good job. The other guys don't do anything, and I get the same pay. All of a sudden, somebody's going to, they wasn't even pay originally. Somebody's going to tap me on the back. Somebody's going to say, you're one of the best cops. When you put that element into an organization, it does scare the people who aren't doing their job. But the people who know they can do their job, they just rise right to the top. And they took over. It took about a year, but they eventually took over. And by a year, the culture had changed to a culture of accountability. We were not just looking at the number of arrests or the number of tickets the cops gave out, but what was happening to crime in an area that a commander was responsible for? What was happening for crime in an area where the police officer had responsibility, like a beat cop, for that area? If he was finding ways to bring crime down, we were finding ways to reward him. I mean, it's common sense, except, bureaucracies resist it. And maybe it was easier with the police, because even though they didn't have it, they are kind of modeled on the military. So it's a little bit easier to get them to accept something like that, but it didn't happen right away.
When you became mayor, you inherited an increase of about 4,000 police. That was a response to the disaster before you got there, but they were on the way in. How big a factor was that?
Big. I added 5,000 to that. I increased over a period of a year and a half, by about 10,000 police officers. But it was really knowing how to use them rather than having that many. They had increased the police department in the past to almost that same number, and crime went up. The CompStat system allows you to strategically analyze your people and put them in the right places. One of the major things that I did that brought down black crime, I reassigned police officers from wealthy white neighborhoods to Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Fort Greene. So basically, we had the same number of police officers in every police station. One of them could have, 500 murders and the other one 10. We had the same number of police officers. So I doubled the number of police officers in the places that had 500 murders. So I got a lot of grief because most of the people I was taking police from were people who voted for me. And most of the places I was putting the police are people that voted against me, and they were yelling at me for doing it, but not the community, Newt. I would go to town hall meetings there, and even though I had double the size of the precinct, I would have women that lived there tell me, Mayor, we need more police. And honestly, they did. I just couldn't produce that.
For people who wondered whether or not you could actually have a direct policy impact on the number of murders, on the amount of crime, your record, even in the first 2 years, was astonishing compared to anybody else I'm aware of.
People were waiting for it for so long. There was a built-up demand for it. The first 2 years, if I recall correctly, probably was a quarter of the overall decline over 8 years. It was about 25% decline in the first year, which would be, by the way, Newt, it's about the increase that has taken place in the last 8 weeks. Murder is up 28% right now. That hasn't happened since the day I became mayor, that murder was up that much.
The national debt is nearing $25 trillion. And with the trillions more spent during COVID-19, what impact do you think that will have on the value of the dollar? The U.S. has already spent more than $6 trillion on the coronavirus. Who do you think is going to pay for that? Gold and silver are your hedges against inflation and global instability. Unlike stocks, gold will never be worth zero. Protect your savings and your retirement with precious metals. Birch Gold Group is a company you can trust to help you diversify your portfolio into precious metals by converting your eligible IRA or 401k into an IRA backed by precious metals. There's no cost, no obligation. They're simply wanting to educate you on the benefits of diversifying. Text Newt to 474747 and diversify today. Again, text Newt to 474747.
Juarez, Mexico, is one of the most famous border cities in the world, and for 30 years, it's been home to a series of unsolved murders. Hundreds of young women have disappeared there without a trace.
Numbers started to rise, and then a lot of theories were floated up. The serial murder, the cartels, some sort of strange devil worship.
In Forgotten Women of Juarez, we follow a story that's left a trail of destruction in its wake, with FBI agents, forensic experts, reporters, and victims' families.
There could be an abduction in broad daylight. No one saw it. No one talked about it. These were like ghosts.
And we discover a web of corruption on both sides of the border.
It was scary when you think about who may be involved. Oh my God, it's like, oh my God.
It's a very, very, very dangerous place of the city. I wouldn't recommend you guys to go back.
Binge the first season now and find Forgotten Women of Juarez on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
As you look out right now at the sources of money, Soros seems to have almost a dimension for trying to strengthen criminals and weaken the forces of law and order. What's your take on all that?
This is coordinated with Black Lives Matter because he's one of the biggest contributors to Black Lives Matter. He does it through two other companies, RFOP and Thousand Currents. And Thousand Currents, by the way, is run by a convicted terrorist, Susan Rosenberg, who was convicted when I was U.S. attorney. She got a 58-year prison sentence for the bombings of Weather Underground, who were dedicated to the slaughter of police. And then she was pardoned by Clinton. She only served 16 years of a 58-year sentence, even though at the sentencing she said, the only remorse I have is I didn't do that final shootout with the police and take them down. So she's the in-between between Soros and Black Lives Matter. At the same time, he started to fund DA's races all over the country, very, very different places. Like the DA in St. Louis was bringing the case against the McCluskey family, the family that was holding the gun to protect themselves in front of their home. St. Louis Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner was the one that charged Mark and Patricia McCluskey of St. Louis with felony weapons count for trying to defend themselves when there is a clear law in Missouri which completely exonerates them. It's called the Castle Doctrine. And it says you can hold a gun at someone, basically, if they're on your property. The DA in Philadelphia has been selected by Soros, and it's a disaster in Philadelphia. He becomes DA, property crime goes right to the top because he doesn't prosecute property crime. Police have demonstrated against that and don't work with his office. Murder is up in Philadelphia right now by 30% because we have a DA that doesn't prosecute a lot of criminals, and he lets them out of jail. He doesn't get bail on them. The DA in Contra Costa, California, where the woman who covered over the Black Lives Matter sign is being prosecuted for a hate crime. That's a DA elected by Soros. And the most interesting one going on right now is in Los Angeles, where there is an African-American district attorney named Lacey. From my view, she's too pro-criminal, but she's a good district attorney. And she is being accused of not having prosecuted enough police officers. Well, I mean, they have to be guilty to prosecute. You can't just go prosecute them because some criminal says that they were brutal or they did something wrong. Criminals are mostly going to lie. So you get a case like the Floyd case. I think it was very, very clear. But you don't usually get a case like that. You usually get a case where the person is shooting at the cop first. Well, she's not going to prosecute that unless she's a crazy ideologue. So they're going after her with Soros money to put in the DA of San Francisco named George Gascon. Now, Soros got him elected 5 years ago. In the last election for San Francisco DA, he was defeated because property crime rates went up dramatically. I think San Francisco became number 2 in property crime, and the property crime in San Francisco was twice the property crime in Los Angeles. And it was really hard to figure out why. He didn't prosecute it. So they threw him out. Soros put a lot of money behind him, but Soros got defeated by the people of San Francisco. He's running that guy for district attorney of Los Angeles, the guy who screwed up San Francisco. And he's leading because the DA's husband got into a situation like the St. Louis situation. There were these protesters at his door. He's a 67-year-old black man. And he walked out with a gun and he said, if you don't get off my property, I'm going to shoot you. And they're prosecuting him. She had to recuse herself, obviously. And they're prosecuting him and they're demonstrating against him Black Lives Matter every week. She's considered to be one of the best district attorneys in the country, just on a substantive basis. Liberal, but one that I would respect tremendously. It looks like they're going to defeat her.
But what do you think is the underlying rationale of being so unbelievably pro-criminal? I look at New York now where there's no bail. So there's a story of the bank robber who robbed the bank every single day, got arrested every single day for 6 straight days, and got released every single day. And finally turned to the cop and said, what do you have to do for him to keep you?
Well, you're not exaggerating. If you translate it to drug dealing, you know what it says? The drug dealers have taken over these neighborhoods in about 3 weeks. They've all come out of the closet from somewhere. All that shooting that you're seeing in New York, 70% are drug related, but they can use their guns again. And what the community sees is the big shot drug dealer in the neighborhood gets arrested. And 5 hours later, he's back. Now, you're never going to get cooperation from a community about who the big drug dealers are if the big drug dealer that gets arrested is back in 4 hours. And then they begin to think that the system is corrupt. They don't think we would be stupid enough to have a no bail law. So they think he must have paid off the cop or he must have paid off the judge. And a lot of them, by the way, go and say that because they want to run the community. This is insidious. We have a man as mayor who doesn't understand it.
Soros puts up millions and millions of dollars through an amazing range of organizations. What do you think motivates him? This is a country which offered him refuge, which enabled him to become very wealthy. You would think he would like us, but it's pretty clear he hates us. Do you have any idea at all why?
Well, I can only speculate because I've been dealing with him for 30 years. He believes that we should have a socialist government. I think he enjoys chaos. He seems to maybe some psychological need for chaos. He's also done in parts of Eastern Europe where he's gone ahead and transformed district attorney's offices There, he's turned them into corrupt operations that protect his businesses. And that's where he learned it. He wants to overthrow the form of government we have, completely destroy our American way of life, and replace it with this, I guess for him, utopian dream of an international world.
What is it the average citizen now, whether in New York or in Minneapolis or wherever, what should they do to try to turn all this around?
This is a battle for, I'm going to save our way of life. All these things are at stake. Our family, our government, our police forces. So this is a fight for what America is going to be all about. And I think that's the level at which the president has to fight it. He's the only one that can stand against it right now. This is the biggest election in our history. The next 20 or 30 years will get affected by this. We're either going to continue to be a basic free enterprise system, or we're going to have this crazy kind of combination of socialism and reparations for racism and political correctness.
I tell people it's the most significant election since Abraham Lincoln in 1864, that had Lincoln been defeated, his opponent would have accepted the secession of the South, given up on slavery, and the Union would have basically been over. And I think similarly, the gap between Biden, Pelosi, and Schumer on the one side, and Trump and McConnell and McCarthy on the other, we have not ever seen in our lifetime this big a gap in terms of which way the country will go. And in a sense, the gap between what you did to bring down crime and what de Blasio has done to increase crime is a similar parallel, if you will, to where we were. And so I think this has been extraordinarily helpful. And I really want to thank you. I really appreciate you doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you to my guest, Mayor Rudy Giuliani. You can read more about restoring law and order to our cities on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Debbie Myers, and our producer is Garnsey Slump. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. Please email me with your questions at gingrich360.com/questions. I'll answer them in future episodes. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. On the next episode of Newt's World, what really matters for Black lives? A controversial subject in today's current culture, but my guest has a point of view given his many years of experience. Robert Woodson Sr. is an American civil rights activist, community development leader, author, and founder and president of the Woodson Center. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.
Juarez, Mexico, is one of the most famous border cities in the world, and for 30 years, it's been home to a series of unsolved murders. Hundreds of young women have disappeared there without a trace.
Numbers started to rise, and then a lot of theories were floated up. The serial murder, the cartels, some sort of strange devil worship.
In Forgotten Women of Juarez, we follow a story that's left a trail of destruction in its wake, with FBI agents, forensic experts, reporters, and victims' families.
There could be an abduction in broad daylight. No one saw it. No one talked about it. These were like ghosts.
And we discover a web of corruption on both sides of the border.
It was scary when you think about who may be involved. Oh my God, it's like, oh my God.
It's a very, very, very dangerous place of the city. I wouldn't recommend you guys to go back.
Binge the first season now and find Forgotten Women of Juarez on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.